All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to today's book club meeting. Invisible Cities. We've read a little bit more, and I couldn't help but feel this sort of idea that I don't necessarily know how to express, but I'm going to work on it as best I can in this short time that I have before I got to go. I was sort of thinking that, what is a city in the first place? I mean, can I sort of set myself besides this book and give some sort of picture as to what details a city itself? What is it from there being little room for what is objectionable, or a lot of room for all the people that would perhaps fill a city in regards to the ideas of what a city was and perhaps what somebody is doing there? And the first thing that I couldn't help but feel was this whole idea of wanting to be alone. Like, there is some idea that we can have of things when we're alone, maybe more so than when we're with somebody. And it's this whole idea that maybe everything treats us in a way that we are sort of understood. It allows us to become lost, almost, to wander. And I think wandering is much more of a state of being enamored than it is by just being in a desolation. It's sort of this idea that we can be lost. And I think that it's this idea of being alone that sort of allows us to be lost. And it allows us to interact with our world in a very certain and specific way. And that's what I kind of want to try to express, is what that certain and specific way is. I think that it has to do with sort of a processing. Like, if somebody just says the word God, but they give you no structure as to what it is, I think that ultimately what my thoughts on God are in these last couple days is that God is a process. And if you don't represent God in the way of a process, then a lot of people probably won't be able to process God. And so I think that probably the most apt way, at least the word that I'm feeling today and the other day as well, is that God is a process. And so if you don't lead things up to the process of where you then state something in such a manner, then are they going to necessarily get the process? And what if that's what I'm saying is? You know, that God is a process. And it's sort of like that whole idea of power that I sort of left on the other day, where I came from this place where, you know, there was direct power in all things. And it was more so of a power of this origination of all things. It was this idea And it's even hard for me to explain right now. And I know that I had a whole thought process that I went through before I said, you know, do you believe that things come from power? And I had a direct lineage of thoughts which led to that corresponding question ultimately. And what I'm trying to do is sort of backtrack myself to come to that place where I can state what that power might in essence mean by giving it a process. And I don't want to just sort of stare off in space while I do this, you know. I was okay with doing that on my last video because it almost felt like, you know, maybe my look was in perfect harmony with sort of what I was feeling at that time. And it sort of said much more than I could by trying to explain myself almost. And again, I'm always pressed for time, you know. It's like, even if you have all the time in the world, that doesn't necessarily mean that the timing of what you do is the best. So you try to do whatever you can, you know, with an appropriate amount of timing as well. Even if you have all the time that you can think of, right? And so ultimately, I think that what power itself can almost be reduced down to, it's this idea of control and this idea of there being a plan. Hello. And I'm not sure exactly what the words were that I was thinking. I'm going to do my best to try to retrace my steps here. A lot of it had to do with belief. And then maybe if there was one solid thing to begin with, then that solid thing that we had was belief. And maybe you have to sort of step things down for sort of we'll figure it out. The presentation that you're kind of going for. And so maybe in a real sort of place where I'm trying to enact a very sensory experience, it's much more aggression. But maybe just the idea of saying that things come from a place that's true is sort of a more level-headed way to say it, now that I'm trying to explain things. Where before, I was sort of navigating the realms of belief and honesty and being bold. But in saying that in a much more level-headed kind of way, that do you think that things come from a place that's true? And the whole question is sort of self-fulfilling, right? Because things have to come from a place that's true, right? But the more that you identify that everything comes from a place of truth, it ultimately has to, right? I think that you can sort of relate everything. And ultimately what happens when you relate everything is, I think that it gives you freedom once you can relate things. Relating things is like understanding how things work. And the more that you understand how things work, the more that you can use work to your advantage. Right? It can sort of be the immovable place kind of thing. And I think that there's some real, I'm stumbling upon something right there when I say, you know, the more you can relate things, the more that you're free. And I think that this has to deal with a lot of the idea that everything has a common point of existence. Okay? And the more that everything has a common point of existence, I think that what that means is as much as any of this is, you can also say that we exist inside of something imagined as well. We exist in that idea of where we say, is there truth in something that's made up? Well, obviously the truth is in the ability of our being able to speak, but not, we would then decipher more and say not necessarily in the words themselves, right? But what I'm getting at then is that maybe in the place from which all things relate to, there is a freedom there. And it's this freedom that in that place we are just a story, or we are just imagined. And I think that it should be freeing, because then if we can do that at a certain point in our own life, then what we can say is that we are able to express freedom at that point by overcoming. And maybe all work is, and mechanical advantage, is just the output of our ability to gain intention from somewhere, to see something difficult, to understand its meaning, and then to find a way to work with it and understand the process. And then when we understand the process, we can understand freedom, which is God, which I think that's what power is. So in the place where all things relate, and we understand this process, relation is the process, okay? Then we understand that as much as any of this exists, in the place where it all relates, it's freedom. It's freedom to be anything. And ultimately, I sort of, wanted to then relate that to this whole idea, because it's playing off these notions, right? Of, and that's a real level-headed way to say it without it being something that's sort of bursting, but perhaps again that is just another method or an approach to sort of a moment. And this is sort of a stepwise process rather than a sheer wall, sort of thing that I'm approaching here with it. But I think then what that means is that as much as things mean something, they come from a place where anything can mean anything. And so what we need to do is understand that perhaps in these ideas of all these reflections, and we get into this whole idea here. An oracle was questioned about the mysterious bond between two objects so dissimilar as the carpet and the city. One of the two objects, the oracle replied, has the form the gods gave the starry sky and the orbits in which the worlds revolve. The other is an approximate reflection, like every human creation. It's like two tails following each other. And the thing about it is the more true one becomes, the more that the other becomes a story. But the more true that the other story becomes, the more the other tale becomes a story. And so I think that it's sort of like this revolving, mechanism, right? And I think that that's ultimately how reality sort of entangles itself with itself, sort of thing. And as I'm getting to this whole idea of understanding, where we have people and places, and sometimes we like to give places names of people that we love, or things and ideas and all this stuff, so that things change places and we get a picture of what would that be in regards to all the context that we know. What would it be if it was something that we didn't know? And then how would we know that it was something that we knew, but this time we didn't know what it was, but it was still relating to something that we tried to imagine was, sort of thing, right? And it's just that string of, a string with knots on it, sort of thing, telling us a story. And I think that it makes sense, and it sort of is poetry and feeling. And when I say, do you believe that things come from a place of power? Do you believe that things come from a place of feeling? Because if they do, then think of all the things that you can do. If everything comes from a place of feeling, then it means that you're free to be alive as well. You're free to feel. You are free to express yourself. You're free to be real. And I think ultimately that's the funny thing about this book, is that it's two people being real, even though it's made up by some guy living however far away from these events themselves. It's just a story of people being real with each other, which is people really being people, right? And again, it's this whole idea of, well, when is it more real than when we're in a city and it's sort of like we're lost? But being lost is sort of like a freedom, because then we have no responsibility, and then we're able to really understand things that we see, versus having an interaction with something, dealing with the process itself. We can get caught up, we can be caught with our words, with our own words. We can lose our place, and we can have a very wonderful experience or none, just like within these cities, And in which city is it like we're communicating with a person, and in which city is it like we're just, lost in it, sort of thing? And which one is more real? But I'm gonna kind of keep it a little bit shorter today than my other ones. I think I kind of said everything that I wanted to say. And it's like interacting with the process. Can we ever catch up with it? It's like the people are the summations of a process. Even though I say that a city is a process, but we're sort of much more in it. And so I think that, what we can learn from this is we can learn to deal with each in this way, so that we can understand maybe how to overcome the process when we're in the process, and how to recognize the process when we're looking at the process itself, right? And recognizing how much of a process do we introduce two different things in our lives. This is a learning experience. It should be something that we grow from, trying to read these things and understand them and how we apply them and what we think about them. And if we're going to introduce the idea that all things are a fable, then perhaps we should use as much tact as we can to try to use things to an advantage, which is sort of either eliciting a process or not with certain things, and with certain words too. But that's kind of all I really wanted to say today on that, and really didn't know what I was going to say until I, just said it right here. So I'm kind of watch that process unfold, and that's our word of the day, is process, obviously, if you haven't gotten that yet, So word of the day, process. There's much more to being lost as well. And there's probably much more, as well in being found. So and which one allows us to communicate? Which one really knows who we are? Kind of thing. And I know that there's sort of a way that I'm trying to project what a city is too, and that's ultimately kind of my final question that I kind of wanted to answer in this video that I started with, right, is sort of what was my depiction of a city. But and I want to be able to say something in a different way where I can sort of put myself in line, right, with other things that are along these same lines. I think maybe I could just do something like, see what's the best way to do this, like I've been telling you about this city now. And for as many cities as there are that are like this city, there are verses and versions where everything still means the same thing. However, all the words are rearranged in a different ordering, so that everything seems as though it's what came first. But when you see the city, you'll know that it's still the same city it was at first. And it's always the same city until one thing is different. And then when we're in that other city and everything's different, it's different up until the point in time in which we recognize difference. The point in time in which we understand what difference itself is. Not necessarily that something's different, it's just the idea of our ability to speak. Maybe that's all that there's ever been. What is solid? And what has a process.